Sign the papers, or I'll make sure you never see another sunrise. That's what my own son-in-law said to me. Not a stranger. Not some criminal off the street. The man I'd welcomed into my family 23 years ago. The man I'd handed half my business to because I believed in him. I still remember the exact moment I realized what was happening. It wasn't dramatic. There were no raised voices. No slammed doors. It was a Tuesday morning in late autumn, and I was sitting in my own kitchen in the Blue Mountains, watching the mist roll across the valley, when my solicitor called and told me my signature had appeared on documents I'd never seen in my life. My name is Graham Whitfield. I'm 64 years old. For 31 years, I built a commercial property development company from nothing, from a single block of land in Western Sydney that I bought with money I'd borrowed from my father and paid back every cent of within 18 months. By the time I was 55, Whitfield Property Group was valued at just over $1.8 billion. Not because I was lucky, because I worked 7 days a week for 3 decades and never once cut a corner I shouldn't have. I want you to understand that before I tell you the rest of this story. Because what happened to me wasn't the story of a careless man. It was the story of a man who trusted his family completely and nearly lost everything because of it. My daughter, Sophie, was 38 when this started. She'd married Daniel Mercer when she was 25, and I'd liked him well enough at first. He was sharp, well-presented, confident in the way that young men sometimes are before life has tested them properly. He came from a comfortable family in Melbourne, had a degree in commerce from Melbourne Uni, and when he asked me for a job 6 months after the wedding, I said yes. I thought I was doing right by my daughter. Over the years, Daniel worked his way up. He wasn't incompetent. I'll give him that. He understood numbers, understood contracts, could read a development proposal, and spot the weak points quickly. By 2019, I'd made him Chief Operations Officer. He was running day-to-day operations while I focused on strategy and major acquisitions. I was thinking about stepping back. I was 61, my knees were giving me trouble, and my wife Margaret, God rest her soul, had passed 2 years before from a stroke. The company felt heavier without her beside me. She'd always been the one who kept me honest about people. You see what you want to see in people, Graham, she used to say. I see what they are. I didn't understand how right she was until it was almost too late. The first sign something was wrong came in March of 2024. My personal accountant, a woman named Roberta Fenn who'd worked with me for 19 years, called me on a Saturday morning, which she never did. She said she'd been reviewing some intercompany transfers and found movements she couldn't reconcile. Amounts between $200,000 and $800,000 moved through a subsidiary company called Mercer Capital Solutions, a company I didn't know existed. I told her she must be mistaken. She said she'd checked 3 times. I told her to say nothing to anyone and send me everything she had. That weekend I sat alone in my study and read through 47 pages of financial transfers, shell company registrations, and amended directorship documents. By Sunday night, I understood that Daniel had spent at least 2 years systematically moving assets out of Whitfield Property Group and into entities he controlled personally. The total, as best as Roberta and I could estimate, was somewhere north of $60 million. But that wasn't the worst of it. The documents that arrived in my solicitor's inbox, the ones with my forged signature, were far more serious. They were staged board resolutions, dated 8 months earlier, authorizing a restructure of the company's shareholding. Under those documents, my shareholding had been diluted from 68% to just under 12%. Daniel's shareholding, through a series of nominee companies, now sat at 54%. On paper, Daniel Mercer owned my company. I sat with that knowledge for a long moment. The mist was still on the valley. The house was very quiet. I thought about everything I'd built every early morning, every difficult negotiation, every risk I'd taken and managed carefully over 31 years. I thought about my daughter, and what her role in this was, or wasn't. I thought about my two grandchildren, 8 and 11 years old, asleep in the back rooms of this house every second weekend when Sophie dropped them off. Then I picked up the phone and called the one person I trusted completely. His name is Terry Baxter. We'd been friends since we were 17 years old, working school holidays at the same timber yard in Penrith. He became a detective with NSW Police, served for 22 years, and retired early to run a private investigations firm in Parramatta. He was the best man at my wedding. He delivered one of the eulogies at Margaret's funeral. He is the kind of man who, when you call him on a Sunday morning and say, "I need help," doesn't ask questions before saying, "Tell me where you are." He was at my door by 11. We spent 6 hours at my kitchen table. Terry listened without interrupting, while I walked him through everything. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Graham, the forgery alone is a criminal matter. But before we go to the police, we need to know the full picture. Because if there's more, we want to find it first." He was right. And there was more. Over the following 6 weeks, Terry worked quietly. I went about my business as normally as I could manage, attending meetings, reviewing proposals, sitting across boardroom tables from Daniel, and watching him as though I didn't know what he'd done. That was one of the hardest things I've ever done in my life. Every time he smiled at me and asked how I was, every time he called me Graham in that easy, familiar way, I had to hold everything I knew behind my face and smile back. What Terry uncovered during those 6 weeks was methodical and devastating. Daniel had begun planning this at least 3 years earlier. He'd used a junior staff member, a contracts administrator named Kyle, 26 years old and desperate for money, dealing with a gambling problem, to access and photograph internal documents. He'd engaged a document forgery service operating out of a server in Eastern Europe, which Terry traced through a series of transactions. He had a personal solicitor, not the company's solicitors, who had prepared the fraudulent board resolutions, and he had a business partner, a property developer from Queensland named Stafford Rees, who was set to purchase Whitfield Property Group's most valuable asset, a 42-hectare development site in the outer northwest of Sydney, rezoned for residential use and worth in excess of $400 million at a price significantly below market value, with the difference understood to be returned to Daniel through a private arrangement. The transaction was scheduled to complete in 11 weeks from the moment Terry showed me the documents. There was one more thing. Terry had obtained Daniel's communications with Rees through methods I won't detail here, but which were sufficient to be passed to the appropriate authorities. In one exchange, from 6 months prior, Daniel had written, "The old man is slowing down. He trusts me completely. By the time he realizes anything is wrong, it'll be done." The old man. I read that line 3 times. I want to be honest with you. I'm not a man who cries easily. I didn't cry when I read it. But something shifted in me permanently in that moment. Some last remaining hope that there was an innocent explanation, that I'd misunderstood something, that Daniel was the man I thought I knew. It closed off like a door being quietly shut. I asked Terry what we needed to do. He said, "We do this properly. Every step documented. Every piece of evidence preserved. We don't touch anything that could contaminate a prosecution. And we pick the moment carefully." I agreed. What I did next? I did after consulting with my solicitor and Terry together. I retained a specialist fraud barrister, a woman named Diane Colquhoun, who had spent 15 years as a Crown prosecutor before going to the private bar. She was precise, methodical, and the calmest person I have ever met in a crisis. She reviewed everything over 4 days and told me that what we had was, in her words, one of the more comprehensively evidenced fraud cases she had seen presented to her in a preliminary brief. She outlined a strategy. We would file a civil claim in the Supreme Court, seeking to set aside the fraudulent share restructure and freeze all assets associated with Daniel's nominee companies. Simultaneously, We would provide the criminal evidence package to the Australian Federal Police's fraud squad. Diane had a contact there, a detective superintendent she'd worked with during her prosecution years. The filing was scheduled for a Wednesday morning. On the Tuesday evening, I called Sophie. That conversation is the part of this story I find hardest to speak about. Sophie was my daughter. Whatever Daniel had done, I had no certainty about what she knew or didn't know. She was 38 years old, a mother of two, and she was married to a man who had spent years deceiving her father in ways that, if she was innocent of it, would shatter her world. She came to the house alone. She sat across the kitchen table from me, the same table where her mother used to help her with homework, where she'd eaten birthday dinners as a girl, where we'd sat together 2 years ago and cried over Margaret. I placed the documents in front of her. I sat quietly while she read. It took her a long time. When she looked up, her face was pale, in a way I hadn't seen since her mother's funeral. "Dad," she said. And then nothing else, for a while. I said, "I need to know if you knew anything about this." She said she hadn't. I believe her. Not because she's my daughter, I'd learned by then that love doesn't guarantee honesty, but because of what came next. She told me that over the past 18 months, Daniel had been pressuring her to convince me to give him formal control of day-to-day operations, that he'd told her I was losing focus, becoming forgetful, that I should step back entirely for my own well-being, that he'd suggested, more than once, that I should consider transitioning the business formally. She hadn't understood what he was building toward. She thought he was being practical. She thought he cared about me. She sat at that table for nearly 2 hours. She didn't defend him. She asked me what she needed to do. I told her. And she did it. The next morning at 8:47, Supreme Court proceedings were filed. Asset freeze orders were served on 17 entities associated with Daniel Mercer and Stafford Reese. AFP fraud squad officers attended Daniel's office at Whitfield Property Group at 9:15, an office in a building I owned, on a floor I'd designed, at a desk I'd given him. I was not there for that. Terry offered to take me, but I said no. I didn't need to see it. I'd already seen what I needed to see. I did see Daniel one more time, approximately 3 weeks later, in the car park of a shopping center in Penrith. It was accidental. He was with his own solicitor. I was alone. We stood about 8 meters apart. He looked like a man who had not slept properly in 3 weeks, which I imagine was accurate. He started to speak. I said, "Daniel, anything you want to say, you can say to my barrister. I've got nothing for you." I walked to my car and drove home. The legal proceedings took 14 months in total. The share restructure was set aside in its entirety by the Supreme Court. The fraudulent documents were declared void. 41 of the $62 million in diverted funds were recovered through the asset freezing orders. Daniel Mercer was charged by the AFP with 7 counts of fraud, 2 counts of obtaining financial advantage by deception, and 1 count of forgery. He pleaded guilty to 5 of the charges to avoid trial. He was sentenced to 4 years and 8 months, to serve a minimum of 2 years and 10 months. Stafford Reese, in Queensland, faced separate proceedings and agreed to a civil settlement. Kyle, the young contracts administrator who had helped Daniel access documents, cooperated fully with investigators from the beginning. He was 26 years old, with no prior history. His barrister made submissions about his gambling problem and his exploitation by a significantly more powerful figure. He received a suspended sentence. I don't harbor bitterness toward him. I hope he found his way. Sophie divorced Daniel within 3 months of his guilty plea. That was her decision, made without pressure from me. Though I won't pretend I didn't feel something close to relief. She and the grandchildren still come to the Blue Mountains every second weekend. The kitchen table is still the same one. We don't talk about Daniel much. There's nothing useful left to say about him. Whitfield Property Group is still mine. A little battered. A little altered by what happened. but mine. I'm 64 years old now, and I still go into the office 3 days a week. The Northwest Sydney development site settled at full market value through a transparent competitive process 18 months ago. The returns were everything I'd projected when I first acquired that land. I stood in the sales suite on the day contracts exchanged, looking out at the site that someone had tried to steal from me, and I felt something I can only describe as quiet. Not triumphant, not vindicated exactly, just quiet, as though something that had been vibrating at a frequency just beyond hearing had finally gone still. I've thought a lot about what I would say if someone asked me what I learned from all of this. I'm not a man who goes looking for lessons in hard experiences. I think sometimes bad things happen because people make bad choices, and the lesson is simply to choose better. But there are a few things I know now that I didn't fully understand before. I know that the people most capable of harming you are the ones you've let close. This isn't a reason to keep people at a distance. Margaret would have disagreed with that strongly, and she was wiser than me. But it is a reason to keep your eyes open even when your heart is at ease. Especially then. I know that trust must be earned continuously, not granted once and left to stand indefinitely. I gave Daniel my trust for 23 years and never once revisited whether it was still warranted. I confused longevity with reliability. Those are not the same thing. I know that vulnerability in age is real, and that there are people who will look at an older man or woman who has built something and see not a person but an opportunity. The most effective defense against that isn't suspicion, it's structure. Clear legal structures, trusted professional advisors, records and documentation that don't depend on goodwill to hold together. I know that good people, Terry, Roberta, Diane, are worth more than any asset on any balance sheet. I would not have gotten through this without them. Not the legal process. Not the nights in that house alone. None of it. And I know this. What Daniel tried to take from me was a company. What he actually tried to take was 31 years of my life's work, my father's investment in me, my children's inheritance, my late wife's legacy. He didn't succeed. But even the attempt, even the knowledge that someone I broke bread with for 2 decades was capable of, that changes you in ways that don't entirely go away. I don't say that to frighten you. I say it because pretending otherwise would be dishonest, and I'm too old for dishonesty now. What I can tell you is that the betrayal did not define what came after. It was a chapter, a terrible, exhausting, clarifying chapter in a story that continues. The mist still comes across the valley on autumn mornings. The grandchildren still argue over the remote control in the living room. The company is still standing. And so am I. If you are reading this and you are in the middle of something that feels insurmountable, a betrayal, a loss, a moment where the ground has shifted beneath you, I want you to hear this from a 64-year-old man who has been there. The ground comes back. It takes longer than you think it should. It doesn't look exactly the way it did before, but it comes back. Document everything. Trust carefully. Know your own worth well enough that no one can convince you to sign it away. And hold close the people who show up on a Sunday morning without asking why. That's all I've got.